rain lashed against the hospital's old steel-framed windows, each drop a sharp reminder of the storm outside. Claire Jenkins sat in the corner of the dimly lit waiting room, clutching her coat tighter. It was past midnight, and the fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She had come here to visit her grandmother, who'd been rushed into emergency surgery earlier that evening. Yet the longer she waited, the heavier the air felt, as if the building itself was breathing. Claire had always hated hospitals. Their antiseptic smell, the hum of machines, the occasional muffled cries from rooms. It all felt unnatural, like death lurked just behind the pristine white walls. But this hospital was different. St. Marlowe's had a reputation in the town, whispered stories of things seen in the corners of its darkened hallways. She had brushed them off as urban legends, tales to scare kids. Yet, sitting here now, she wasn't so sure. The receptionist, an older woman with kind eyes, had disappeared an hour ago, promising to check on her grandmother's progress. Since then, Claire had been utterly alone. Her phone buzzed in her lap, breaking the silence. A text from her boyfriend. "Still waiting? Call me if it gets too late." She typed a quick reply, but hesitated before sending it. Something about reaching out felt wrong, as if acknowledging her unease would give it power. Her gaze drifted to the hallway on her left, where the emergency ward lay. The lights down the corridor seemed to grow dimmer the further they stretched. She thought she saw movement, just a flicker, but dismissed it as her tired mind playing tricks. The storm's howling winds weren't helping her nerves. A low creak sounded. Claire froze. It came from behind her, where the double doors to the old wing stood. That part of the hospital had been shut down years ago, condemned due to structural instability. Her grandmother had told her once that it was where St. Marlowe's first opened, back in the 1920s. It had a maternity ward then, though most births ended tragically in those days. "Too many souls entered and left this place," her grandmother had said, her voice laced with warning. Another creak, louder this time, as if someone, or something, was pushing against the doors. Claire stood up, her breath hitching. "Hello?" she called out, her voice shaky. No response. She considered going back to her car, but guilt held her in place. Her grandmother had been more than family. She was Claire's anchor after her parents died. She couldn't leave her. Not now. Steeling herself, Claire walked toward the double doors, her sneakers squeaking on the linoleum floor. She reached out to touch one of the doors, its paint peeling like old skin. The moment her fingers brushed it, the door swung inward with a loud groan. Beyond the threshold lay a corridor bathed in shadows, the flickering light bulbs barely illuminating the cracked tiles and faded posters on the walls. "Maintenance," Claire muttered to herself, trying to find solace in the mundane explanation. Yet, as she stepped inside, the air felt colder, heavier, as though she had crossed into another world. A loud clang made her jump. Her heart pounded as she whipped around, only to see a metal gurney rolling slowly down the hallway toward her. It stopped abruptly, its wheels screeching against the floor. Her throat tightened as she stared at the empty gurney. It was just physics, right? A loose floor or a draft from the storm. She told herself that over and over, but the rationalization felt thin, hollow. "Is someone there?" Claire's voice echoed down the corridor. This time she heard something, a faint whisper. The sound was indistinct, almost like a child's voice. It sent a chill racing up her spine. She backed away, her hands trembling. But before she could turn, the whisper grew louder, morphing into a low, guttural moan that seemed to vibrate through the walls. She stumbled, her breath quickening as she looked around wildly. That's when she saw it. At the far end of the hallway, a figure stood in the shadows, its outline barely discernible. It wasn't moving, but Claire felt its gaze, cold and penetrating. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice a mix of fear and defiance. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a single step forward, its form becoming clearer. It was a woman, or at least it resembled one. Her hospital gown was tattered and stained, her hair hanging in damp clumps around her pale face. But it was her eyes, or rather, the absence of them, that froze Claire in place. Hollow sockets stared back at her, black as voids, and yet somehow filled with a terrifying intensity. Claire turned and ran, her sneakers slipping on the wet tiles. She didn't dare look back. The whispering had returned, now accompanied by the faint sound of bare feet slapping against the floor, chasing her. Her mind raced with fragments of logic. Ghosts aren't real. This can't be happening, you're just tired. But none of it mattered because the fear consuming her was undeniably real. She burst through the double doors into the waiting room, slamming them shut behind her. Her chest heaved as she pressed her back against the doors, waiting for the inevitable push from the other side. Seconds passed, then a minute. Silence. The lights in the waiting room had stabilized, their flickering gone. The storm outside seemed quieter too, as if the hospital itself had returned to normalcy. Claire exhaled shakily, her pulse still hammering in her ears. She grabbed her coat, ready to leave, when she noticed something on the floor. A piece of paper lay at her feet, damp and yellowed with age. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. It was an old photograph, the edges frayed. The image showed a group of nurses standing in front of St. Marlowe's, smiling proudly. But there, at the edge of the group, was a woman in a tattered hospital gown, her face pale and hollow, and those empty eyes stared straight at Claire. Claire's hands trembled as she stared at the photograph. Her breathing grew shallow, and a wave of nausea washed over her. The woman in the picture, her hollow eyes, her tattered gown, it was the same figure she had seen in the abandoned hallway. The realization clawed at her mind, sending a chill coursing through her veins. The photograph slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the ground like a dying leaf. Claire backed away, her heels catching on the edge of a chair. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, to put as much distance as possible between herself and whatever was lurking in this place. "Get a grip," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "It's just a coincidence, that's all." But deep down, she didn't believe it. The way the figure in the photograph stared, no, pierced, through her felt intentional, personal. She didn't know how or why, but Claire felt certain that the woman wasn't just some ghostly remnant. She was aware, and she had chosen Claire. A loud crash shattered her thoughts. It came from the hallway she had just fled, the sound of something heavy hitting the floor. Claire froze, her instincts screaming at her to run, but something else, morbid curiosity or sheer terror, kept her rooted in place. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and uneven, as if someone, or something, was dragging a broken limb. Claire's stomach churned as the sound drew closer, each step echoing through the empty waiting room. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to scream, to cry, to do anything but stand there helplessly. The double doors creaked open. Claire's breath caught in her throat. The figure stepped into the room, its bare feet leaving faint, wet impressions on the floor. The woman was even more terrifying up close. Her gown clung to her gaunt frame, stained with what looked like dried blood. Her hair hung in damp, matted strands, and those empty sockets where her eyes should have been seemed to pulse with an otherworldly darkness. But what made Claire's blood run cold wasn't her appearance. It was her smile. A wide, unnatural grin stretched across the woman's face, her cracked lips curling as if she were savoring Claire's fear. "Why, me?" Claire managed to croak, her voice trembling. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head, her movements jerky and disjointed, like a puppet on frayed strings. She raised one hand, her bony fingers twitching, and pointed at Claire. Claire staggered backward, her mind racing. She needed to escape, but every exit felt impossibly far away. Her phone. She fumbled in her pocket, her shaking hands barely able to grip it. The screen lit up, casting a faint glow in the darkened room, and then the lights went out. The waiting room plunged into darkness, the only sound the ragged gasp of Claire's breathing. She fumbled with her phone, its light barely illuminating the space around her. She could hear the woman's footsteps again, slow and deliberate, circling her. "Stop!" Claire screamed, her voice breaking. "Leave me alone!" The footsteps stopped. Silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Claire held her breath, her fingers gripping the edge of a nearby chair for support. She swung her phone's light wildly, desperate to see where the woman had gone. Then, just over her shoulder came a whisper. "Don't you remember?" Claire spun around, her phone slipping from her hand and clattering to the floor. The woman was inches from her, her smile impossibly wide, her face tilted in an expression that was almost sorrowful. Claire stumbled back, crashing into a row of chairs. Her mind raced. Remember? What was she supposed to remember? She didn't know this woman, she was sure of it. But as she stared into those hollow sockets, fragments of something began to stir in her memory. A hospital room, a storm, a voice crying out for help. "No," Claire whispered, shaking her head. "I don't know you." The woman tilted her head further, her grin fading into something more sinister. "You left me," she said, her voice a low, guttural rasp. "You promised you'd come back, but you didn't." Claire's chest tightened. The words felt like daggers, stabbing at something buried deep within her. But it didn't make sense. She had never broken a promise like that. Had she? "I don't understand," Claire stammered. "Who are you?" The woman took a step closer, her bony fingers reaching out. Claire recoiled, but there was nowhere left to run. The cold, clammy hand brushed against her cheek, and in an instant, the room dissolved into darkness. When the world came back into focus, Claire was no longer in the waiting room. She was standing in a hospital room, though it was unlike any she had ever seen. The walls were stained with rust-colored streaks, the air thick with the metallic scent of blood. A single bed sat in the center of the room, its sheets twisted and stained. Claire's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor. She didn't understand what was happening. Was she dreaming? Hallucinating? The woman stood over the bed, her skeletal frame casting a long shadow in the dim, flickering light. She turned to Claire, her hollow sockets locking onto her. "You left me," the woman said again, her voice echoing through the room. "You said you'd be there, but you weren't." Claire shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't. I swear I didn't." The woman raised her hand, and suddenly, Claire's memories came flooding back. The night her best friend Emily had died. The storm. The car accident. Claire had been with her in the ambulance, promising to stay by her side. But when the paramedics rushed Emily into surgery, Claire had frozen. The fear of hospitals, of death, had been too much. She had left, telling herself she couldn't bear to watch. "No," Claire whispered, her voice trembling. "That's not true. I couldn't." "You chose to leave," the woman hissed, her grin returning. "And now, you'll stay." Before Claire could scream, the room began to collapse around her, the walls folding inward like the jaws of some monstrous beast. The last thing she saw was the woman's hollow eyes, glowing with a dark, unforgiving light. Claire woke to the sound of faint beeping. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a moment, she thought she was back in reality. The room was brighter, filled with the soft hum of machines and the sterile scent of antiseptic. She was lying on a hospital bed, her head pounding as though she'd been struck by something heavy. She tried to sit up, but her body felt weak, pinned down by invisible weights. The room looked normal, even comforting. Sunlight streamed through the blinds. Birds chirped faintly in the distance. For a brief, fleeting moment, Claire allowed herself to believe it was over. Then she noticed the photo. It was sitting on the bedside table, the same weathered photograph she had found in the waiting room. Her pulse quickened as she stared at the group of nurses, her gaze instantly drawn to the figure on the edge, the woman in the tattered gown. This time, her hollow eyes seemed to be staring directly at Claire, her cracked lips curving into a faint smile. Claire's breathing grew ragged. She ripped the photo off the table and shoved it into the drawer. "It's not real," she muttered, as if saying it aloud could make it true. "None of this is real." The beeping grew louder, sharper, cutting through the quiet room like a knife. Claire looked to the heart monitor beside her, its display flashing erratically. The lines spiked and dipped faster and faster until they blurred into chaos. Panic surged through her veins. She pressed the call button for the nurse, but nothing happened. The light above her door flickered once and went dark. "Help!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Someone, please!" The door creaked open. Her heart dropped. Standing in the doorway was the woman. Her gown hung in tatters, her face as pale and hollow as before. But this time, she wasn't alone. Shadows moved behind her, vague shapes that twisted and writhed like smoke. Faces flickered within the darkness. Blank, featureless faces that whispered incomprehensible words. "No," Claire gasped, shaking her head. "This isn't happening." The woman stepped into the room, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the floor. The shadows followed, spilling into the space like a tide of ink. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing heavier with every passing second. "You left me," the woman said again, her voice layered with the echoes of countless others. "You left all of us." The shadows swirled closer, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. Claire pressed herself against the bed, her mind racing. "I didn't mean to," she cried. "I was scared. I didn't know what to do." The woman stopped at the edge of the bed, her hollow eyes locking onto Claire's. "Fear is no excuse," she said, her voice like the grinding of stone. "You ran from the truth. Now it's time to face it." The shadows surged forward, engulfing Claire in an instant. She screamed, thrashing against the invisible weight that pressed down on her. Images flashed before her eyes. Emily's pale face in the ambulance, the sound of the storm outside, her own reflection in the rearview mirror as she drove away. She saw the nurses, the doctors, all the lives she had passed by without a second thought. And then she saw herself, standing alone in the waiting room, her face pale and haunted. "No!" she screamed, her voice raw. "Please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to leave her. I didn't mean to leave anyone." The shadows seemed to pause, their whispers fading to a low hum. The woman leaned closer, her face inches from Claire's. For the first time, there was no malice in her expression, only sadness. "Regret is a heavy burden," she said softly, "but it's not the end." Claire blinked, tears streaming down her face. The shadows began to recede, the room brightening as they dissolved into nothingness. The woman stepped back, her hollow eyes fixed on Claire. "Remember this," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness. "You can't run forever." And then she was gone. Claire woke with a start, her body drenched in sweat. She was back in the waiting room, slumped in one of the uncomfortable chairs. The receptionist was shaking her shoulder gently, her face etched with concern. "Miss, are you all right?" the woman asked. "You've been sitting here for hours." Claire looked around, her heart racing. The waiting room was normal again, bright, bustling with nurses and patients. The storm had passed, the morning light streaming through the windows. She touched her face, half expecting to find traces of the nightmare lingering, but everything felt real. "Your grandmother's out of surgery," the receptionist continued. "She's asking for you." Claire nodded numbly, her mind still reeling. She stood on unsteady legs, following the receptionist down the hallway. As she passed the double doors to the old wing, she couldn't help but glance at them. They were shut tight, their peeling paint untouched. When she reached her grandmother's room, she found the old woman sitting up in bed, her face pale but smiling. "There you are," her grandmother said, her voice weak but warm. "I was worried about you." Claire forced a smile, sitting down beside her. "I'm fine," she said, though the words felt hollow. As they talked, Claire glanced out the window. The hospital grounds stretched out below, serene in the morning light. But in the glass's reflection, she caught a glimpse of something that made her blood run cold. A woman in a tattered gown stood just outside the door, her hollow eyes staring directly at Claire.